My name is Darby Durbin, and I am a research assistant in the Functional Hearing Lab at Boys Town National Research Hospital in Omaha, Nebraska. Our lab works with children and adults who either have normal hearing or use bilateral cochlear implants to study how spatial hearing abilities develop. In the long run, we hope that our research will help configure hearing devices for pediatric patients that can maximize spatial hearing in real-world listening environments. Spatial acuity is defined as the ability to discriminate between two sound sources that are close together in space. This aspect of spatial hearing is crucial to navigating everyday environments, like distinguishing which direction a car is coming from when crossing a busy traffic intersection. Bilateral cochlear implants give some individuals with severe to profound hearing loss some access to spatial hearing, and while spatial acuity in bilateral CI users is generally poorer than in children with normal hearing, many of these children are still able to develop this skill. In fact, research shows that spatial acuity can begin to emerge as early as 2 to 3 years of age in children who receive early bilateral CI activation. However, real-world listening environments aren't quiet or ideal, and children live and learn in classrooms, gyms, and other acoustically complex spaces filled with reverberation, which disrupts access to important spatial cues and makes it harder to use spatial hearing effectively. In this study, we created an individualized virtual auditory environment for each of our normal hearing listeners. Before the main experiment, we brought our normal hearing participants into Boys Town's anechoic chamber to measure their head-related transfer functions, otherwise known as HRTFs, using what we call our dummy hearing aids and motion tracking equipment. These measurements capture how sound travels around an individual's head based on their anthropometric features, including their head size and ear shape. To record HRTF, we have our participant sit in the center of a circular 64-speaker array, which completely surrounds the participant. The dummy hearing aids pictured use 2 behind-the-ear microphones and 1 in-the-ear microphone to record sine sweeps playing from the individual loudspeakers. HRTFs recorded in the ear were used to create the spatial audio for the main experiment, which was presented over headphones for our normal hearing participants. This process was not repeated for bilateral CI users, and instead of recording individual HRTFs, we used the standard KeyMar HRTF. We tested spatial acuity by determining the smallest amount of angular separation between our 2 sound sources at which our listener can tell that the sounds are distinct. In our MAA game, the listener hears 3 of the exact same sounds. The first 2 sounds are presented from the same location, while the third sound is presented from a slightly different position, either to the left or to the right. The listener's job is to identify which direction the third sound moved. Like we talked about, humans rely on spatial cues to localize sounds. We predicted that reverberation would reduce signal similarities between the ears, leading to a widened auditory image of the sound source and subsequent reduction of spatial acuity. In other words, individuals would require a larger minimum audible angle and reverberation than in anechoic conditions to detect a spatial separation between 2 sound sources. Because of how cochlear implant signal processing works, important auditory information such as temporal fine structure is largely removed. In addition, the spectral resolution is limited due to the reduced number of effective frequency channels in the cochlea. As a result, we expected reverberation to have an even greater impact on CI users' spatial acuity. Specifically, we expected their minimum audible angle, or MAA, to be larger in reverberant conditions when compared to listeners with normal hearing. In the absence of reverberation, normal hearing listeners show significant improvements in spatial acuity with increases in age. Given those age-related improvements in spatial acuity observed in normal hearing listeners, we also ask whether a similar developmental trend might be present in bilateral cochlear implant users. We tested 119 normal hearing listeners ages 6 to 29 and 20 bilateral cochlear implant listeners ages 7 to 23, with a mean age of 14 years old for both groups. And before I show you some data, I would like to orient everyone to the X and Y axis. The X-axis displays the reverb conditions at the top of the figure and the age of participants in years at the bottom of the figure. And we use 3 different levels of reverb, R0 being anechoic, R1 being low reverb, and R2 being high reverb. The Y-axis displays MAA in degrees to the left and sound token to the right. And you'll notice that we use 2 different types of sound tokens. We use speech-shaped noise and the disyllabic word blue jay. It's important to note that the smaller the MAA, the better the listener was able to distinguish our two sounds as coming from distinct locations. And for this figure and following figures, the regression line is fitted to child data only to examine the developmental effect of spatial acuity. In the absence of reverberation, we observed a significant effect of age on MAA for both speech-shaped noise and word tokens in our normal hearing group. This means that as participant age increased, the MAA required to detect a spatial separation between two adjacent sound sources decreased and spatial acuity improved. In our low reverb condition, MAA continues to significantly decrease with age. You'll also notice that the trajectory line shifts slightly up from anechoic to low reverberation, suggesting some degradation in spatial acuity due to reverberation. And once again, we see that the developmental trajectory line shifts upward from low reverberation to high reverberation. However, when we look across age groups, we also see a clear improvement. Older children perform better than younger ones, even in more reverberant conditions. Now consider someone who might not have access to all the spatial cues a typically hearing person does, such as someone who uses cochlear implants. The developmental trajectory of spatial acuity hasn't been explored in bilateral CI users because this group has a lot of individual variability when it comes to age of activation and how often they wear their CIs. And to explore the possibility that bilateral CI users have similar developmental trajectory to normal hearing listeners, we tested a large sample size of 20 bilateral CI participants ages 7 to 23 years old. Looking at performance in anechoic conditions, bilateral CI listeners also display a negative correlation between MAA and age. Bilateral CI listeners also need a much larger MAA than normal hearing listeners, which is consistently at least 10 degrees larger than normal hearing MAA throughout development. In low reverberation, spatial acuity continues to improve with age. And looking at this figure as a whole, bilateral CI listeners had poorer spatial acuity than normal hearing listeners and required about a 10-degree larger MAA across reverberation condition and token type. Although CI participants have larger MAA thresholds overall, bilateral CI listeners have measurable MAA thresholds even in high reverberation, indicating that they do have the ability to discriminate between two sound sources. So what does this tell us about spatial acuity and bilateral cochlear implant users? Our preliminary results suggest two key findings. Pediatric recipients of bilateral CIs demonstrate spatial acuity both in free field and reverberant conditions, and while they require larger spatial separation for detection, children with bilateral CIs seem to develop spatial acuity at a similar rate as normal hearing peers over time.